I'm here in front of Jaguar House in the corner of my North Norfolk constituency because many of you have emailed me in the past few weeks with concerns about government plans to turn this into temporary accommodation for asylum seeking and refugee families. Now, this is a topic which generally tends to attract a lot of very strong emotions, and it's easy for the facts and for reasonable challenge to get lost in between those two positions. Reasonable questions like, can this country cope with more people than it's currently got? Do we not owe the world and our fellow humans sanctuary when they're fleeing persecution? We might have the right ideals in principle, but what about the practical reality of the system and the people who might seek to exploit it or game it? And don't we need to look at whether the system itself is working, far more importantly than what the right moral answer is to the question if we're going to get this right? Now, I felt I couldn't do justice to this in a few paragraphs of an email, so I invited my colleague Layla Moran onto the Politics Unchained podcast to hear what she had to say about how this debate has become so divisive. Layla, why is this the issue that we seem incapable of having a conversation about without descending into fighting?
I think people feel that this issue, there are a number of these issues that are sort of identity adjacent, and they say a lot, I think, about how someone approaches the world. So you'll often see in sort of polling or when people do sort of personality tests or whatever, you see words like open and closed and fearful, and actually the way you approach things like asylum and immigration are very closely aligned, I think, to how people see all sorts of different parts of the world, but this becomes an issue that starts being talked about through that lens. And you might remember it was issues like this that Cambridge Analytica exploited so effectively during, I think, which was the Brexit campaign, in part.
It was.
And that's why there are certain issues that chime with the soul, and it could be this, it can be, there are other ones too, but this is definitely one of them.
Very interesting. So I'm really keen that we discuss the practicalities, but it's got to be within that framework, hasn't it? We're human beings, we respond to the circumstances around us, and what we say and what we think quite often is drawn from our own first-hand experience,
Exactly.
Whatever that is in the issue of immigration and asylum. Let's talk particularly about asylum, because what you've just described is a really good way of framing why we're in this sort of polarised position about it. But that doesn't change the material facts that we have an asylum system that is granting asylum to about 50,000 people a year. Roughly half of those who apply are accepted and offered asylum. Do you think we have a problem with asylum in this country?
I think it's not just this country. I think there is a global issue with mass migration, and you see it through the history of humanity, that there are moments in time where the world becomes inherently more unstable, and the big thing that looms large is climate change, right? So many of the people who are fleeing, either for conflict or, people talk about economic migrants. Well, what's happened there is that what used to be farmland has now become totally arid. They can't feed their children, and that crisis leads them to seek a new life so that they can do what I would say any human would naturally want to do, which is to stay alive, to help their family thrive, and to do whatever is necessary to do it. So I don't think it's just this country. I think what I notice in this country, and I say this as I'm very much an international citizen, okay? So my view is 100% shaped by my upbringing. My mum was a Palestinian refugee. She left Palestine at 14, moved to Amman. She's never been back, and there's no prospect of us going back, and you'll see what's happened with Gaza and so on, but we live it all the time. And so that sense of the earth is so important. You want to go back. My grandfather became a farmer because his view at the time was, if you cultivate the land for the Palestinians who are still there, that's how the land knows you still want it. And it was a big wrench when they had to leave it. So I see all asylum through those eyes. No one in our family wanted to leave.
Yeah.
They left Jerusalem because the King David Hotel was bombed, and it was frightening. And the thought at the time had been, if we don't move, we die.
Yeah.
And then they move and it becomes more dangerous. And then they're looking at, 5 children at that point. What's the future prospects for them? Well, if they move to Jordan, they're going to have better prospects. And he was right. And so they invested in education. And then my mother became an immigrant, met my father doing a master's in Kent. And here I am. And so, I am a product of many generations of people simply wanting to do the best for their families.
Yeah.
And for me, whenever I think about asylum, and we have to separate those kinds of stories. And by the way, those kinds of families, in my experience, tend to be entrepreneurs. They tend to be resourceful. I welcome that. I welcome that resourcefulness. But it's got to be done within the rules. At no point did my family circumvent rules to enter any of those countries. At no point did they ever not pay tax. And it would have been an affront for them to be a freeloader. In fact, my grandfather, he wrote diaries for us, and he's since passed. And at the top of every chapter was how much money he had in his bank account, because he started with nothing, and he was proud of what he built.
Yeah.
So that spirit, I think, lies in many who seek asylum, and all they want is the best for them and their families, and to contribute to the country that helped them to be safe, to help them to thrive. Now, that's my perspective, driven by my own personal experience. And when I think asylum seeker, I think future entrepreneur.
But you mentioned a really important thing there about your story, which is the horror that your family would have felt if they had bent the rules or broken the rules. Do you think people in that position you just described many thousand times over, I'm sure, from lots of different countries, do they lose out to people because there are people breaking the rules?
Always. It's the same as, when you see sort of the benefit scrounger stories, and actually the vast majority of people on benefits are working and just trying to do the best. It's always the way. And that's why it's so important to separate those two things. And the liberal thing to do, in my view, is you crack down hard, really hard, on those who are circumventing the rules.
And what would be the sort of circumstance that you think would circumvent the rules? Because you can claim some of the sort of the qualifications that would give you asylum without necessarily it being true. So we don't necessarily know that everybody who's applied for political asylum, or everyone who's fleeing persecution, or everyone displaced by war, we just don't know often whether that's true or not. What sorts of circumstances for you would be examples of breaking the rules?
First of all, the rules need to be common sense. So, for example, and I'm sure we'll come to this, but when people, see these people coming over on boats, they need to understand there are no systems by which they can apply.
Yeah.
Right? So you could level at me, well, all these people on the boats are breaking rules.
Yeah.
But there is no system. There is no way for them to even attempt to follow rules because there is no system.
Yeah.
So there needs to be a system. So I think that's one of my main criticisms of what's happening right now, is I firmly believe there need to be safe and legal routes. And the reason why that is because then you can have a conversation and vetting before the fact of, are they someone who is fleeing persecution or not? There does come a point where, and that is a judgment call, that is a moral judgment call. If someone says, this is me, and if I chose to live my life according to the laws that are permissive here, but if I did it there, I risk my life by doing that, and therefore I want to stay here.
How do we deal with that? Because, for instance, we know the decisions that are being made are often wrong. A huge percentage, more than 2/3 of appeals are upheld.
Yes.
We also know that the speed of decision making is ludicrously slow. I think I read somewhere a credible claim that Home Office processes are targeted with resolving 3 cases a week.
Yeah.
I mean, we resolve 3 cases an hour in my office, and we wouldn't get through the end of the week. I know it's slightly more complicated, particularly second as you described, but how do we stop people cheating the system? And I'll come on to why that's so important, I think.
Yeah, for me it's, you have to have very clear criteria to begin with. If you follow the human story through, there are ways that you can try to get to the bottom of the truth. And if someone is found out, I think you should throw the book at them, and they lose that right. But I think also there comes a point where we have to there is always going to be a level of uncertainty in the system, and we have to work out what our tolerance is for it. Because if it is, we assume everyone's lying until proven otherwise,
yeah, No, I agree with you.
Then no one.
So there's always going to be inefficiency in any system.
Exactly. So
but isn't it also true that there's going to be capacity limits in any system? So we can't just choose what we feel is the moral grounds for accepting a claim for asylum. And I'm sure every single person in the country would have a slightly different view about that, but we can't just do that in ignorance of the total capacity to receive and support people. Because 100 claims, 1,000 claims a year.
I'm going to stop you there. Just because of that word support.
Yes, okay.
Because the evidence shows that actually someone who comes to this country and claims asylum is economically more efficient than someone who was born here.
That's a bit of a killer blow, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay,
so overall in their lifetime, it is not the case that we support them more. And in fact, through safe and legal routes, especially if you allow someone to work, they would end up more likely, these are all probabilities,
more likely to be paying tax.
They're more likely to be contributing more to the exchequer than someone who was born here from the off. So in that context, I'm not sure we can, I would just challenge the word support.
I accept the challenge. Let's remove the word support and say that, okay, we take that those statistics for granted, but isn't there a limit to, a ceiling to how many people the UK can take in, regardless of their net contribution to the Treasury from elsewhere? For instance, we are a small country. We're seeing the creaks in our systems all over the place for people that were born here or have already got settled status here. Regardless of how much people are contributing versus taking, there's a perception that we just can't cope when it goes much further than it is at the moment. There must surely be some sort of extra limit or ceiling or capacity restriction. We can't just say these cases fall on the right side, these cases fall on the wrong side.
It's interesting. Perception is doing a lot of work in that assertion.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is I personally think if you look at, and there's, what are they called? Migration Observatory, and there are others who have crunched the numbers. Bearing in mind, we are an aging population. The vast majority of people who come claiming asylum are younger, are people we need in our workforce.
Yeah.
We're going to need them to support, and this is a wider conversation about immigration as a whole. But actually, if you look at the age profile of our country, there is going to come a point very soon, especially as the boomers start retiring, where we are facing a crisis.
So you're saying asylum seekers generally, not that one and that one and that person and or all, but generally, on balance, asylum seekers pay more than they cost, they contribute more than they take, they give more than they need in terms of support, and bottom line is we need those sorts of people in our economy working.
They need to be in our economy working, but we also have, as a complete other line of questioning and important conversation, creaking public services.
Yeah.
But what I found so distasteful about the way particularly the likes of Nigel Farage weaponise this is they say all the problems that we see in our public services. So let's take social care. My committee looked at the issue, in particular the cost of inaction on social care.
Yeah.
Social care, which by the way has a very sizable immigration population that works in it.
Yeah.
And the lack of dealing with social care is in part why that perception of public services and everything's, why are libraries shutting? Why aren't potholes being filled? It's all the immigrants' fault. It's not. It's excessive, bad governance. Something like that. Huge problem, cross-party problem, generational problem.
Yeah. Being blamed on immigrants.
Being blamed on asylum seekers.
So just...
But not asylum seekers' fault.
I get your pitch, and that actually these are people whose entrepreneurialism, whose zeal, whose working age status, and by statistical analysis, whose contribution we need in the UK, we should be welcoming them. Do you think there should be a cap?
No. But...
There must be a political cap, some sort of vague, non-specific number that politicians recognise they can't.
The thing about asylum is, by definition, you can't predict it. Because if someone is claiming asylum properly, as in like they are fleeing something, you can't predict what they're about to flee. You can't predict the earthquake. You can't predict which country it is that's about to descend into civil war.
But we couldn't accept 1 million asylum seekers a year.
So we don't have control globally about where those asylum seekers come from. So I don't think it's right to have a number on it. I think there needs to be a set of principles that lie behind it. And there are perhaps a few things I would aim to agree, because what we haven't spoken about yet is, again, a really difficult thing to talk about, but it's integration.
Yeah. Do we have an integration problem of asylum seekers?
Because so much, well, that's some of the perception. And I think it's wider than just asylum. This is why the hotels are so totemic, right? Because by definition, they're not integrating, because they're not part of these communities, and they're seen, and it's part of that wider conversation about immigration. And it's why, back to your first question, it's so sort of racism adjacent. Because what you're getting are people who are fleeing cultures that are quite different to ours. People ask, what's the difference between the Ukrainians that we took in and perhaps someone from Syria? And I have to tell you, knowing both, the food from Syria is much better. And I took in a Ukrainian for a year, and we're still very much in touch.
But Ukrainians culturally are closer to us.
It's cultural closeness, which people approximate with skin colour and levels of education. Okay? So I firmly believe, and always have, and I say this as someone who was born in this country, but we left when I was 1. I spent most of my childhood not here. And I'm really proud that I'm an MP, in part because for the first time in my life, I have my community.
Yeah.
Because I didn't associate. Now, you can have a community that isn't linked to geography. That's the Palestine side of me, right? Community is more than just geography.
And there are many communities around the world from Western and non-Western backgrounds that have big global populations that aren't living in the country they originate from.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually, I would argue that something that's beautiful about this country is how accepting it is, how diverse it is. It comes from empire, right? There was an upside to empire. There's a controversial phrase that I never want to be clipped on its own. But let me explain. Because there is so much that's awful about empire. But one of the things that it brought us, not just prosperity, but also British people quite naturally look outwards. Because we had this as part of our history. And so I think it is a fundamental fabric of British society to be welcoming to diverse communities. But there is something about Britain that is just British. And it's things like queuing. It's things, no one else does this. It's not until you've left, I think, that you don't realise it's football. It's queuing.
So mandatory queuing training upon arrival.
It's never saying what you think directly. There's things that are just, and it doesn't matter what culture your family came from. There are some things that I just think are just British, and it almost doesn't matter if it's North or South or Scottish or Irish or actually there are things that is in common between all of us.
But I agree with that, and I'm proud of that as well. And what I've seen in my constituency, despite its limited ethnic diversity, certainly speaks to that. But I don't want to go back to the question of should there be a limit. But do you not recognise that the public, whether or not you feel they've been influenced by other voices, feels we've done too much, we've got too many, we can't cope, and that simply telling them no, you're wrong isn't going to...
I'm not saying no. Your question was, should we have a cap? I said no. I don't think it's ever helpful to say to someone you're wrong. Right? That they're not. That's their perception, and this is why I was moving on to integration. Because when they say this is happening, and they're seeing their local towns declining, hence the comments about social care and potholes and so on, they often complain that they don't recognise the people in their town anymore, as much as part, and that's as much, in my view, to do with we're seeing shifts within the UK as well. We're seeing cities aren't ageing, but the rest of the country is. You just have to look at the CMO report on ageing from 2 years ago, and he makes this point: rural and coastal areas are ageing significantly faster. And so you've got, therefore, the mix of population isn't there. You add into that towns that feel like they're going backwards, and then immigrants are coming in who maybe do things a bit differently, look a bit different. And I can understand why people feel like this isn't the town I grew up in. I've got a constituent in one of my towns who went on a fairly recognisable roundabout immigration, and then she said, and if anyone else comes from the estuary into North Norfolk, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I think so what you're saying is the integration thing and the cultural
movement is around the country, demographic movement, is happening in all sorts of ways, not just amongst
and my
asylum
motto,
seekers.
and I think what we can sell, and I think this is what we need to say to people, local is as local does. It doesn't matter if you were born there. This is how I feel about Oxford. I was not born there.
Yeah.
My family are not from there. But boy, am I from there.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty evident. You were elected there. People obviously believe that you are one of them.
But when I was thinking about who am I to stand as the representative for the people of Oxford, Abingdon and Botley, at the time Kidlington, and I thought to myself, actually, if I contribute, if I'm part of clubs, if I'm helping my local groups, if I'm shopping on my high street, if I'm trying to do the best by this community, local is as local does. I don't think it matters if you were born there. But what I think we can do to help this is find ways for communities to actively come together. Oxford's really good at this, by the way. I mean, so good at this. So, we've got faith leaders who come together with local politicians. If something happens in one part, we all talk about it and rally around it. We actively challenge racism where we see it, but we also are very sensitive to where there are tensions, and we try and diffuse it by showing that we talk and therefore other people can.
But some of the poorest communities in Britain have also been given hotels that are housing asylum seekers, essentially as prisoners, regardless of whether they've done anything wrong. Prisons will open doors so people can walk out into the streets and wander around towns, and we've seen that is kind of the opposite of what you've described. If we go back to what you said earlier, it was quite a compelling argument about that what asylum seekers have brought historically to the UK and can bring. Doesn't everybody lose when we throw them in a hotel, wait for months to even hear their claims, and then wait for years to process their 2 out of 3 chance of successful appeal?
Yep.
I mean, doesn't everyone
loses.
Everyone loses.
It's money badly spent.
The 8 billion quid a week on hotel, 8 million quid a week on hotels is outrageous.
I understand the outrage. I'm outraged. My anger is directed at this government, the Conservative government, successive governments, for being crap.
Yeah.
They're the ones who have messed this up.
Because previous to this complete disaster, and not forgetting the ridiculous barge to Stockholm and how much that cost per Legionnaire's outbreak, or the hotels we've got now, or any of the sort of mad stuff that people who are perfectly qualified can't work because the paperwork is taking so long to process them. Isn't it also the case that 20 years ago we didn't have a small boats crisis? Notwithstanding the fact we were in the EU and it was easier to sort of share the management of the issue, but people could apply from thousands of miles away.
Yes.
They got their decision typically within 6 weeks. If they knew it was a no, there's a greater disincentive to try and get into the country.
Yep.
If there's a yes, they could apply. They could come straight into an airport, not to mention the channel crossing. I mean,
and start paying taxes straight away.
It feels to me like that is the number one thing that went wrong, that led to the illegal crossings, where now, it doesn't sound too much like a flourish of rhetoric. Basically, all migrants are illegal until proven otherwise. Yeah. But then we end up spending millions of pounds making them wait while we decide whether they are or not.
Yeah.
Those decisions taking place thousands of miles away works for us, didn't it? Why did it change?
I have no idea.
Why did someone say, let's meddle with this for a bit? And
it was actually the Cameron government that had this was their solution, was to have processing centres that were closer, by which I mean not just first available country that you flee to, actually places in each region.
Yeah.
Where, if you're, and there are safer countries, and not all countries in Africa are dangerous, for example.
Yeah.
You can have processing centres in different countries that people could get to. And the world is an internet place. Like, I've been to some of the poorest communities on the planet, and most people still have access to a mobile phone.
Yeah.
There's absolutely ways that you can do this, and technology could help. So some of the things that happen, taking biometric fingerprints and things like that, you can do a lot of that now.
Yeah.
Using apps.
From the country,
from where the person is.
And then you can work out who they are when they present.
There
anywhere
are ways of doing this. There are ways and I don't think that there's been anywhere near enough creativity. I do think we are now, and the processing times thing is key. In my view, Lib Dems love to call out the army for all sorts. But I genuinely think this should be treated as a national crisis, and Army are brilliant at logistics and sorting through stuff like this. They've got plenty else to do. I do appreciate that, but honestly, this is now fundamentally creaking the foundations of our democracy.
So process this on a backlog by bringing in the army. That's not a particularly snowflake, apologetic liberal thing to say, but you think that's what needs to happen.
Yeah.
And if we manage to do that, to manage down the wait time and therefore the cost, and it sounds a bit inhumane, but the backlog, because the backlog of applications not of people is absolutely vast.
Yeah.
Do you think public sentiment would change?
Not immediately and of itself, because without the safe and legal routes, I genuinely think asylum seekers should be allowed to work within 3 months, say. And at the moment, they're just not at all. In part because then they're contributing.
Yeah.
And how do you? And I should say this by I've got groups in Oxford who have come to my surgery actively supporting some of the people in these hotels.
Yeah.
And what they're saying to me is they are depressed. They don't know what their future holds. The children are struggling to know if this is the school they're going to stay at or not. They desperately want to contribute and not be scroungers. They don't want this. No one wants this. They want to contribute. And so, doing something like processing their applications in good time, and then they'd have to pay it back slowly over time.
Yeah.
That sounds acceptable to me as a solution. I think that's not a bad thing. But you can't do that unless they're working and being allowed to have an income, which, by the way, also feeds into the tax system and also stops mental health deteriorating, helps them stay away from accessing the NHS and other things, and means that they're more likely to be integrated by the time they actually have that positive outcome which they so desperately want. I mean, there's so many good reasons why this is Lib Dem policy.
And the government would be saying things like, well, we're taking action on this and tackling the incentives to come to the UK. There's not much being done to improve the speed of processing.
There's been academic study after academic study after academic study that shows that it is almost impossible to put together a deterrent that would work.
Right, so it is an attractive place for people to apply for asylum.
It's not just that, it's just any kind of deterrent. It's really difficult to do.
But it is an attractive place for people to apply to asylum.
I think Europe is as a whole.
Yeah.
I think the most attractive place to apply to is a place that would take you where you think you could have a future. And it depends on where a lot of these people are coming from. But some will, for example, again, one of our wonderful byproducts of empire is that so many other people speak English.
Yeah.
So if they're looking across the world at where is it that I think I'll be able to apply for asylum and then be able to work straight away, what's the other language I've got? Amazing, they already speak two. But they often do. They speak English almost fluently. Then they'll be I understand why they'd be attracted.
You mentioned empire and some of the sort of spoils of empire, the good things about it, but don't we also have some responsibility for the cause of some of these people's migration in the first place, or should that be sort of bygones left behind because none of us were personally involved in it?
I definitely think for certain countries that should be part of the equation.
Countries like what?
Well, the Caribbean countries and Windrush comes to mind, right?
Yeah. So
a lot of those populations we owe much of our infrastructure to, and it just feels very much like here goes up the drawbridge. I'll point to Palestine.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got people trying desperately, and I'm supporting a number of Gaza students trying to come and study at Oxford University. They've made the difficult decision already that they're going to come alone and not bring their family. This is a gentleman who's got a 3-year-old child and his wife. And you can see the scenes from what's happening in Gaza, and the Home Office won't confirm whether or not he's got a visa or not. Now, He's not about to come over illegally, but the point is there are different parts of the world where we've had our hand in the turmoil that we still see, and I definitely think it should be one of those things that we take into account.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, people talk about reparations, and where I've never been one for let's have a tribunal and give out lots of money and hair shirts and none of that, but I think it's a dereliction of duty to not recognise our own history. The other thing I would point out is this is why people paint 0.7% of GNI on aid as a bleeding heart liberal thing.
Right.
It's not. It's a naked self-interest thing.
Yeah.
You can also do the bleeding heart liberal thing, And I do think, poverty is something that should be tackled everywhere. But also, what is one of the drivers of this? It is war. It is climate change. It is turmoil. What if we did spend just a bit more money helping those countries to stabilise, having DFID used to have incredible reach and incredible trust in some of the worst governed countries in the world.
Yeah.
And we lost that in a stroke of a pen when the department was abolished. And now we've reduced the amount of money that we're giving to stabilise the countries of origin because we're paying for asylum hotels. I mean, we are now...
They've literally come out of the international development budget now.
Literally, it's come.
It feels like we've pulled out a lot. We've pulled out a lot in terms of our reach and our influence, but also the routes and the legitimate ways people can apply for asylum. I think there's still, a feeling that we've let the system not only break, but let too many asylum seekers through the doors, and it's really hard to uphold that very reasonable sounding sort of decision process that you talk about. But it's hard to do it in practice. No. Really hard to do it in practice.
We've moved into an age of posturing, and I worry about the government. I am a Liberal Democrat for one reason alone, and it's really boring. I want policy that works.
Yeah.
I would rather spend my whole life banging on about policies that are actually going to make a difference because they're evidence-based and thought through than join a political party, get elected, and then be part of the problem.
Yeah.
Literally, that's why I'm a Liberal Democrat. It was in the context of education, but the way we make policy, by being evidence-based about it, by being reasonable about it, by taking into account all the different arguments and then landing on a solution that might actually work, means that we are so often in hindsight proven right because eventually people get that. Now on this, I think this is a really important issue to get right. And so I don't think we can just say, oh, it sounds very reasonable, but no! We need to solve this, and we need to be honest with people about what that's going to take. And if it takes, it's not going to be the snake oil salesman who says that if we leave the ECHR, it's all going to be solved. This is the same snake oil salesman who sold us Brexit that caused the problem in the first place.
And the EHPR presided over only a handful of judgments that went against the government in the past year, so that's clearly not the reason that we've
There is no one thing that's going to fix this. There is one thing that is going to fix this, and that's good governance.
Yeah.
And that's better politics and political parties who don't posture, but think.
Layla, let's talk about what government are doing and what you think about it. They're talking about processing reforms. Is that going to make things faster?
Sounds good. But if it's tinkering around the edges, it's not going to work. They need to break the back of this.
Well, they're going to expand detention.
Oh, God, this is such a backward step.
Why is that? Don't we need more detention facilities?
Well, no, because, as the Campsfield closing campaign that we felt worked so well, in 2017, it was a Tory government that was closing our detention centres because they could see that the direction of travel, off the back of various reviews that had happened at that point, was that the detention estate in the UK was some of the highest in the world. We still have indefinite detention in this country, by the way, which is a disgrace. We're one of the few countries in the world that still have indefinite detention, which basically means you've got inefficiency built into the system.
But isn't that better than hotels?
Yes, but hotels are you're talking about two different forms of failure.
Yeah, okay,
Which form do you prefer?
So it's a no detention expansion. You've talked about the crackdown on pull factors. You say, for various reasons, English speaking, Europe as a whole being attractive, but nothing seems to dissuade people.
No,
why is that?
You can understand it. Just put yourself in their shoes for just a moment. You're fleeing persecution, war, your livelihood.
But what about people that aren't doing that though? Isn't it too attractive for people that just feel as though their motive is, I think I can game the system here?
Well, this is why we need safe and equal routes, so we can very quickly work out. If you are someone fleeing, you go to your easiest way to work out how to be safe, and you do that.
Yeah.
Anyone else who's trying to come here and work illegally on the black market or whatever else, which is, by the way, why digital ID is just not going to work.
Because they're already not carrying IDs.
They're going to find a way to game there. It's just the most stupid argument. I know why.
But also, employers already require entitlement to work checks. They're either doing that already without digital ID.
You know why they're doing it with digital ID. There is one simple reason alone why they're doing this, and it's linked to asylum, and it's that France won't accept a return scheme unless
without digital ID.
I remember going to a speech by the essentially the Home Secretary of France, where they were saying Britain's problem comes from this. And so we've traded away parts of our...
Yeah.
I'm so mad about this.
So
Anyway,
it's a no on detention expansion. It's a no on crackdown on pull factors, because you're saying won't work. Potential offshoring 2.0.
Oh, what, Rwanda, but other countries?
Well, we heard it mentioned, didn't we?
Yeah. Let's see. Because
that worked really well last time,
I was
didn't
going
it?
to say,
200
so
million
I'm not
quid
sure what's
for
better about other
D20.
countries than Rwanda, but suddenly the government seems to have had a Damascene conversion. As long as it's not Rwanda, but it's other countries, it's okay.
Okay, yeah. What about things like family reunion reforms? Because isn't it still a little bit too easy to bring family members into this country?
See, this I will defend. If we just had a whole conversation about community, and where is some of this consternation coming from? It's people feeling that people aren't integrated into their community, that they're not part of the same town. And so if you've got someone fleeing, it's not just them fleeing. They're probably not just them who's unsafe. And so if they end up claiming asylum, it's, the elderly, the young, they are far less able to make these long journeys. It's understandable that it's the unfit man that comes first. But if you want them to have a full and productive life, contributing to our communities and contributing to our exchequer, I think it's reasonable that so long as it's done in the rules and they're paying their way and all the rest of it, that they should be allowed in the same way as we would to have their families.
But that works, but that makes sense, but only within some overall sense of what a proportionate, manageable number is.
Sure, I mean, I think, and again, a nuclear family is probably the limit. I mean, I come from a culture in the Arab world, second and third cousins are family.
Yeah.
I would draw the line.
Yeah.
And my second and third cousins, I would, however, argue that my mother, my sister, my son, my daughter were very much, and I think, you could probably draw a line around the nuclear family.
Okay. Property seizure. So we're going to take assets from people as down payment on their cost to the state for the support they receive.
I think they've already ruled this out.
Oh, have they?
Okay. I think this came
because
from...
they've realised that we don't let them work, so they're never going to be able to pay that stuff.
Exactly, and actually the answer to this is let them work. But, are they going to be taking people's wedding rings off them at the border and that kind of thing? This came from...
It's got some unfortunate connotations, all that,
It's
isn't it?
horrible. It's horrible. It comes from the Danish model. So what they're doing is they're following very closely what's happened in Denmark, and that's one of the things that I don't know if they do or they propose to do. My understanding is the government has actually ruled this out, and I would agree with them.
So one of the things that people bring up from the experience of the asylum system as it is now, not necessarily because of asylum seekers, but because of the whole piece, is crime. And you talked about people who've committed heinous crimes. We can't seem to deport them efficiently, but there's also a fear and a perception that areas with higher concentrations of asylum seekers suffer from high levels of crime, and some fairly reasonable statistical patterns to suggest that's true. What do we do about that?
So I'm not on top of what those patterns show, but we need to look at them carefully, because if what we're seeing is higher rates of crime in areas around, for example, asylum hotels, I mean, that is failure. That's failure all over. And in part, that's happening because they're not being allowed to work, they haven't got some kind of an income, that's causing them to fall idle. They shouldn't be doing it. But I also would argue that if you give someone no job, no hope, and then nowhere to go and no future, that is a hotbed for encouraging someone to think, well, sod this. I'm not excusing what they're doing, and I think once they do it, I'm afraid that is a Rubicon crossed. I genuinely believe that. Whatever it is, I'm afraid to say, as awful as it is, there is no excuse, because that is already saying, I am not going to abide by the laws of the country that I've gone to. So I do think that, I'm afraid that for me is a red line. But we also have to accept a level of responsibility for creating that in the first place.
Yeah.
I would also say, we've got a whole separate issue about law and order in this country, and under-resourced police, and community policing, and there's a whole a host of other things there. And I think it also, I'd love to know if it's correlation or causation here, because there will be some communities where it is cheaper and easier to have a hotel in rural and coastal areas, for example, where we've also seen, the last police counter shut because it's no longer efficient and so on. And how much of that's correlation and how much of that is causation?
Well, that's a really interesting point. And I think my reflections on our conversation have reminded me of how we are so powerfully shaped by our experiences. And I'm particularly grateful to you for sharing your personal story, because that's clearly shaped your perspective, but not in a way that sort of put you on one side or the other. It's just given you an insight that a lot of us don't have. I think on the having said that, of course, some of my constituents and in rural and coastal communities, their experience is they're seeing things going wrong, they're seeing things getting worse. They might be also seeing a change in the ethnic makeup of their communities, and being fearful of what they hear and see about rising crime rates, because migrant hotels do often find themselves put in places that are cheaper, and let's face it, those are where people are probably already suffering from more poverty than elsewhere in the country. So I think we're not necessarily going to win all those arguments with statistics. We're probably going to find that people's real experience of the world is the most powerful thing that shapes their opinions on issues like this. And part of our job as politicians is to convey that experience and use it to inform the decisions that we take and how we communicate them as well. So I think to that end, thank you so much for coming and doing just that today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I thought Layla made some really great points in that conversation, not least reminding us of the value that refugees have brought to this country over generations, the work ethic, the enterprise, the willingness to do the jobs that we need and to pay taxes to put into our communities and to our society. But it didn't half leave me thinking that the system itself is not serving anyone. It's not serving us. It's also not serving the people who are fleeing persecution, and that we really need to look at where it's going wrong. 20 years ago, we didn't have a small boats crisis, but then in the meantime, previous governments have taken away almost all of the legitimate routes to apply for asylum. People used to be able to do so in the consulates and embassies in their countries of origin and countries en route, and now they can't. And what that means is that people turning up on the French coast are probably an undistinguishable mixture of genuine asylum seekers fleeing persecution, people who know how to game the system, and people who genuinely want to come here to cause us harm. And we have no way of separating the three out. So if we're going to solve this problem, if we're going to create the right sort of climate for compassion, for asylum, but also for bringing people into this country to integrate and play a part in our future, we've got to tackle the system and fix it where it's been broken over the past few years.